Chapter 32 The Politics of Boom and Bust. The Republican Old Guard returns. Warren G. Harding, inaugurated in 1921, looked presidential. With erect figure, broad shoulders, high forehead, bushy eyebrows, and graying hair, he was one of the best-liked men of his generation. An easygoing, warm-handed backslapper, he excluded graciousness and love of people. So kindly was his nature that he would brush off ants rather than crush them. Yet the charming, smiling exterior concealed a weak, inept interior. With a mediocre mind, Harding quickly found himself beyond his depth in the presidency. "God, what a job," was his anguished cry on one occasion. Harding, like Grant, was unable to detect moral hellacious in evil associates, and he was soon surrounded by his poker-playing, shirt-sleeved cronies of the Ohio gang. A good guy, Harding was one of the boys. He hated to hurt people's feelings, especially those of his friends, by saying no, and designing political leeches capitalized on this weakness. The difference between George Washington and Warren Harding, or in a current quip, was that while Washington could not tell a lie, Harding could not tell a liar. "He was not a bad man," said one Washington observer. "He was just a slob." Candidate Harding, who admitted his scanty mental furnishings, had promised to gather about him the best minds of the party. Charles Evans Hughes, masterful, imperious, incisive, brilliant, brought to the position of Secretary of State a dominating, if somewhat conservative leadership. The new Secretary of the Treasury was a lean and elderly Pittsburgh aluminum king, Andrew W. Mellon, multi-millionaire collector of the paintings that are now on display in Washington as his gift to the nation. Chubby-faced Herbert Hoover, famed feeder of the Belgians and wartime food administrator, became Secretary of Commerce. An energetic businessman and engineer, he raised a second-rate cabinet post of first-rate importance, especially in drumming up foreign trade for U.S. manufacturers. But the best minds of the cabinet were largely offset by two of the worst. Senator Albert B. Fall of New Mexico, a scheming anti-conservativist, was appointed Secretary of the Interior. As guardian of the nation's natural resources, he resembled the wolf hired to protect the sheep. Harry M. Daugherty, a small-town lawyer but a big-time crook in the Ohio gang, was supposed to prosecute wrongdoers as Attorney General. GOP reaction at the throttle. Well-intentioned but weak-willed, Harding was a perfect front for enterprising industrialists. McKinley-style old borders settled back into place with a heavy thud at war's end, crushing the reform seedlings that had sprouted in the progressive era. A nest-feathered crowd moved into Washington and proceeded to hoodwink Harding, whom many regard as an amiable boot. This new old guard hoped to improve on the old business doctrine of laissez-faire. This plea was not simply for government to keep its hands off business, but the government to help guide business along path to profits. They subtly and effectively achieved their ends by putting the courts and the administrative bureaus into safekeeping of fellow stand-patters for the duration of the decade. The Supreme Court was a striking example of this trend. Harding lived less than 3 years as president, but he appointed 4 of the 9 justices. Several of his choices were or became deep-eyed reactionaries, and they buttressed the dike against popular currents for nearly 2 decades. Harding's fortune choice for Chief Justice was ex-President Taft, who not only performed his duties ably, but surprisingly was more liberal than some of his cautious associates. In the first years of the 1920s, the Supreme Court acted progressive legislation. It killed the federal child labor law, stripped away many of labor's hard-won gains, and rigidly restricted government interviews in the economy. In the landmark case of Adkins v. Children's Hospital, the court revised its own reasoning in Moeller v. Oregon, which had declared women to be deserving of special protection in the workplace, and invalidated a minimum wage law for women. Its strained ruling was that because women now had the vote, they were the legal equals of men and could no longer be protected by special legislation. The contradictory premises of the Moeller and Adkins cases framed a debate over gender differences that would continue for the rest of the century. Were women sufficiently different from men that they merited special legal and social treatment, or were they effectively equal in the eyes of the law and therefore undeserving of special protections and preferences? Corporations under Harding could once more relax and expand. Antitrust laws were often ignored, circumvented, or feebly enforced by friendly prosecutors in the Attorney General's office. The Interstate Commerce Commission, to singly out one agency, came to be dominated by men who were personally sympathetic to the managers of the railroads. Harding reactionaries might well have boasted, "We care not what laws the Democrats pass as long as we are not permitted to administer them." Big industrialists, striving to reduce the rigors of competition, now had a free hand to set up trade associations. Cement manufacturers, for example, would use these agencies to agree upon standardization of products, publicity campaigns, and a united front in dealing with railroads and labor, although many of these associations ran counter to the spirit of existing antitrust legislation. Their formation was encouraged by Secretary Hoover. His sense of engineering efficiency led him to condemn the waste resulting from cutthroat competition, and his commitment to voluntary cooperation led him to urge businesses to regulate themselves rather than to be regulated by big government. The aftermath of war. Wartime government controls on the economy were swiftly dismantled. The Wartime Industries Board disappeared with almost indecent haste. With its passing, progressive hopes for the government regulation of big business evaporated. Washington likewise returned the railroads to private management in 1920. Reformers had hoped that wartime governmental operation of the lines might lead to the permanent nationalization. Instead, Congress passed the Ash-Cummings Transportation Act of 1920, which encouraged private consolidation of the railroads and pledged the Interstate Commerce Commission to guarantee their profitability. The new philosophy was not to save the country from the railroads, as in the days of the populace, but to save the railroads for the country. The federal government also tried to pull up the anchor and get out of the shipping business. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920 authorized the Shipping Board, which controlled about 1,500 vessels, to dispose of much of the hastily built wartime fleet at bargain basement prices. The board operated the remaining vessels with conspicuous success. Under the Lawful Seamen's Act of 1915, American shipping could not thrive in competition with foreigners, who all too often provided their crews with wretched food and starvation wages. Labor, suddenly deprived of its wartime crutch of friendly government support, limped along badly in the post-war decade. A bloody strike in the steel industry was ruthlessly broken in 1919, partly by exploiting ethnic and racial divisions among the steel workers, and partly by branding the strikers as dangerous Reds. The Railway Labor Board, a successful body to the wartime labor boards, ordered a wage cut of 12% in 1922, provoking a 2-month strike. It ended when Attorney General Daugherty, who fully shared Harding's big business bias, clamped on the strikers, one of the most sweeping injunctions in American history. Unions wilted in hostile political environment, and membership shriveled by nearly 30% between 1920 and 1930. Needy veterans were among the few non-business groups to reap lasting gains from the war. Congress in 1921 generously created the Veterans Bureau, authorized to operate hospitals and provide vocational rehabilitation for the disabled. Veterans quickly organized into pressure groups. The American Legion had been founded in Paris in 1919 by Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Legionnaires met periodically to renew old hardships and let off steam in good-natured horseplay. The Legion soon became distinguished for its militant patriotism, rock-ribbed conservatism, and zealous anti-radicalism. The Legion also became notorious for its aggressive lobbying for veterans' benefits. The chief grievance of the former doughboys was monetary. They wanted their dough. The former servicemen demanded adjusted compensation to make up for the wages they had lost when they turned in their factory overalls for military uniforms during the Great War. Critics denounced this demand as a hold-up bonus, but millions of veterans deployed heavy political artillery. They browbeat Congress into passing a bonus bill in 1922, which Harding promptly vetoed. Reforming their lines, the repulsed veterans gathered for a final attack. In 1924, Congress again hoisted the white flag and passed the Adjusted Compensation Act. It gave every former soldier a paid insurance policy due in 20 years. adding about adding about 3.5 billion to the total cost of the war. Penny pinching Calvin Coolidge sternly vetoed this measure, but Congress overrode him, leaving the veterans with their loot. America seeks benefits without burdens. Making peace with the fallen foe was the most pressing problem left on Harding's doorstep. The United States, having rejected the Treaty of Versailles, was still technically at war with Germany, Austria, and Hungary nearly 3 years after the armistice. Peace was finally achieved by lone wolf tactics. In July 1921, Congress passed a simple joint resolution that declared the war officially ended. Isolation was enthroned in Washington. The Harding administration, with the Senate irreconcilables holding a hatchet over its head, continued to regard the League of Nations as a thing unclean. Harding at first refused to even support the League's World Health Program, but the new world body was so much important to be completely ignored. Unofficial observers were sent to its seat in Geneva, Switzerland, to hang around like detectives shadowing a suspected criminal. Harding could not completely turn his back on the outside world, especially the Middle East, where a sharp rivalry developed between America and Britain for oil drilling concessions. Remembering that the Allies had floated to victory on a flood of oil, experts recognized that liquid black gold would be as necessary as blood in battles of the morrow. Secretary Hughes eventually secured for American oil companies the right to share in the exploitation of the sandy region's oil riches. Disarmament was one international issue on which Harding, after much indecision, finally seized the initiative. He was prodded by business people unwilling to dig deeper into their pockets for money to finance the ambitious naval building program started during the war. A deadly contest was shaping up with Britain and Japan, which watched with alarm as the oceans filled with American vessels. Britain still commanded the world's largest navy, but the clatter of American riveters proclaimed that the United States would soon overtake it. Public agitation in America, fed by these worries, brought about headline-making Washington Disarmament Conference in 1921-1922. Invitations went to all major naval powers except Bolshevik Russia, whose government the United States refused to officially recognize. The double agenda included naval disarmament and situation in the Far East. At the outset, Secretary Hughes startled to the delegates, who were expecting usual diplomatic fence-straddling, with a comprehensive concrete plan for declaring a 10-year holiday on the construction of battleships and even for scrapping some of the huge dreadnoughts they already built. He proposed the scaled-down navies of America and Britain would enjoy parity in battleships and aircraft carriers, with Japan on the small end of a 5-to-3 ratio. This arrangement sounded to the sensitive Japanese ambassador like Rolls-Royce, Ford. Complex bargaining followed in the wake of Hughes's proposals. The five-power naval treaty of 1922 embodied Hughes' ideas on ship ratios, but only after face-saving compensation was offered to the insecure Japanese. The British and Americans both conceded that they would refrain from fortifying their Far East possessions, including the Philippines. The Japanese were not subjected to such restraints in their possessions. In addition, a four-power treaty replaced the 22-year-old Anglo-Japanese alliance. The new pact bound Britain, Japan, France, and the United States to preserve the status quo in the Pacific. Another concession to the jumpy Japanese. Finally, the Washington Conference gave chaotic China, the sick man of the Far East, a shot in the arm with the nine-power treaty in 1922, whose signatories agreed to nail wide open the open door in China. When the final gavel banged, the Hardingites boasted with much fanfare and some justification of their globe-shaking achievement in disarmament, but their satisfaction was somewhat illusionary. No restrictions had been placed on small warships, and the other powers churned ahead with the construction of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, while penny-pinching Uncle Sam lagged dangerously behind. Congress also pointedly declared that it was making no commitment to the use of armed forces or any kind of joint action when it ratified the four-power treaty. These reservations, in effect, rendered the treaty a dead letter. Ominously, the American people seemed content to rely on their security on words and wishful thinking rather than on weapons and hard-headed realism. A similar sentimentalism welled up later in the decade. when Americans clamored for the outlawry of war. The conviction spread that if quarreling nations would only take a pledge to forswear war as an instrument of national policy, swords could be beaten into plowshares. Calvin Coolidge's Secretary of State, Frank B. Kellogg, who later won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role, was lukewarm about the idea. But after petitions bearing more than 2 million signatures cascaded into Washington, he signed with the French foreign minister in 1928 the famed Kellogg-Briand Pact, officially known as the Pact of Paris. It was ultimately ratified by 62 nations. This new parchment peace was delusionary in the extreme. Defensive wars were still permitted, and what scheming aggressor could not cook up an excuse of self-defense? Lacking both muscles and teeth, the pact was a diplomatic derelict, and virtually useless in a showdown. Yet it accurately and dangerously reflected the American mind in the 1920s, which was all too willing to be lulled into a false sense of security. This mood took an even deeper hold in the ostrich-like neutralism of the 1930s. Hiking the tariff higher. A comparable lack of realism afflicted foreign economic policy in the 1920s. Business people, short-sightedly obsessed with the dazzling prospects in the prosperous home market, sought to keep the market to themselves by flinging up insurmountable tariff walls around the United States. They were spurred into action by their fear of a flood of cheap goods and recovered goods from recovering Europe, especially during the brief but sharp recession of 1920 to 1921. In 1922, Congress passed the comprehensive Fordney-McCumber tariff. Glib lobbyists once more descended upon Washington and helped boost schedules from the average of 27% under Wilson's Underwood tariff of 1913 to an average of 38.5%, which was almost as high as Taft's Payne-Aldrich tariff of 1909. Duties on farm produce were increased, and the principle was proclaimed that the general rates were designed to equalize the cost of American and foreign production. A promising degree of flexibility was introduced for the first time, when the President was authorized, with the advice of the Fact-Finding Tariff Commission, to reduce or increase duties by as much as 50%. President Harding and Coolidge, true to their big industry sympathies, were far more friendly to tariff increase than to reductions. In 6 years, they authorized 32 upward changes, including on their last vital commodities like dairy products, chemicals, and pig iron. During the same period, the White House ordered only 5 reductions. These included mill feed and such trifling items as bob white quail, paintbrush handles, phenol, and crucilic acid. The high tariff course thus charted by the Republican regime set off an ominous chain reaction. European producers felt the squeeze from American tariff walls prolong their post-war chaos. An impoverished Europe needed to sell its manufactured goods to the United States, particularly if it hoped to achieve economic recovery and to pay its huge war debt to Washington. America needed to give foreign nations a chance to make a profit from it so they could buy its manufactured articles and repay debts. International trade, Americans were slow to learn, is a two-way street. In general, they could not sell to others in quantity unless they bought from them in quantity, or lent them more U.S. dollars. Erecting tariff walls was a game that two could play. The American example spurred European nations throughout a feverish 1920s to pile up higher barriers themselves. These artificial obstacles were doubly bad. They hurt not only the American-made goods, but the products of European countries as well. The whole vicious circle further deepened the international economic distress, providing one more rung on the ladder by which Adolf Hitler scrambled to power. The stench of scandal. The loose morality and get-quick-richism of the Harding era manifested themselves spectacularly in a series of scandals. Early in 1923, Colonel Charles R. Forbes, one-time deserter from the Army, was caught with his hand in the till and resigned as the head of the Veterans Bureau. An appointee of the gullible Harding, he and his accomplices looted the government to the tune of about $200 million. Chiefly in connection with the building of veterans hospitals, he was sentenced to 2 years in the federal penitentiary. Most shocking of all was the Teapot Dome scandal, an affair that involved priceless naval oil reserves at Teapot Dome in Elk Hills. In 1921, the slippery Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, induced his careless colleagues, the Secretary of the Navy, to transfer these valuable properties to the Interior Department. Harding indiscreetly signed the secret order. Fall then quietly leased the lands to oilmen Harry F. Sinclair and Edward L. Doheny, but not until he had received the bribe of $100,000 from Doheny and about 3 times the amount in all from Sinclair. Teapot Dome, no tempest in a teapot, finally came to a whistling boil. Details of the crooked transaction gradually began to leak out in March 1923, 2 years after Harding took office. Fall, Sinclair, and Doheny were indicted the next year, but the case dragged through the courts until 1929. Finally, Fall was found guilty of taking a bribe and was sentenced to 1 year in jail. By a curious quirk of justice, the 2 bribe givers were acquitted while the bribe taker was convicted. Although Sinclair served several months in jail for having shadowed jurors and for refusing to testify before a Senate committee. The oily smudge from Teapot Dome polluted the prestige of the Washington government. Right-thinking citizens wondered what was going on when public officials could sell out the nation's vital resources, especially those reserved for the U.S. Navy. The acquittal of Sinclair and Doheny undermined faith in the courts, while giving further currency to the cynical sayings, "You can't put $1 million in jail," and in America, everyone is assumed guilty until proven rich. Still more scandals erupted. President reports as to the underhanded doings of Attorney General Daugherty prompted a Senate investigation in 1924 of the illegal sale of pardons and liquor permits. Forced to resign, the accused official was tried in 1927 but released after a jury twice failed to agree. During the trial, Daugherty hid behind the trousers of the now dead Harding by implying that persistent probing might uncover crookedness in the White House. The brutal fact is that Harding was not a strong enough man for the presidency, as he himself privately admitted. Such was his weakness that he tolerated people and conditions that subjected the republic to its worst disgraces, the President Grant.